Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you on the third day of Genealogies of Memory conference, the third and the last day. Today we will be speaking about catastrophes. And the first panel, which I have a pleasure to moderate, is titled Slow Violence and Memory of Industrial Catastrophes. Let me just introduce you the first speaker, Mateusz Haberski, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Performativity Studies of the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. His academic interests range from performance studies, affect and assemblage theories to Anthropocene studies. In 2050, Mateusz published a book, Doświadczenie synestetyczne, performatywne aspekty przedstawień site-specific. This is official English translation, but I will give it to you. Synesthetics experience, performative aspects of site-specific performance. And in 2019, he published a book entitled Assemblages Experience in the Foggy Anthropocene. Together with Mateusz Borowski, who is also our guest, and Małgorzata Sugiera, who had her speech on the first day, he edited publication Emerging Affinities, Possible Futures of Performative Arts, published by Transcript Verlag in 2019, and with Eva Ball, Situated Knowing Epistemic Perspectives on Performance, published by Routledge 2020. Today, Mateusz will present a speech titled Let Sedimentations Remembering Extractivist Slow Violence in the Post-Socialist Anthropocene. Please, Mateusz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I think it's the right time, the last day of the conference is the right time to snake back on the first day. And I think my presentation will be a kind of a snake back to the epidemics with an environmental and indeed elemental twist. Because in recent years, we have witnessed a host of cultural representations of an event that is often referred to as the epidemic of lead poisoning. In 1975, in one of the poorest areas of the Polish mining region of Upper Silesia, a pediatrician, Joanna Wadowska-Król, diagnosed over 5,000 children with lead poisoning, a disease hitherto attributed to steelworks, ironworks workers. It is not a coincidence that the story has gained traction in Poland in the last 2 years. The image of the young patients, often referred to as ołowiki, the leadies, storming hospitals and preventoria in the 1970s clearly rhymed with the experience of COVID-19 pandemic. However, unlike its more recent and global namesake, the epidemic of lead poisoning has nothing to do with the transmission of an infectious agent between human and more than human bodies. In this context, the word epidemic is rather used figuratively as a pointer to the mass distribution of the effects of the extractivist practice of smelting lead ore on human bodies over a period of time. Thus, the epidemic was not caused by a single spectacular catastrophic outbreak event, but is an example of what the environmental scholar Rob Nixon calls slow violence, to denote anthropogenic environmental catastrophes whose effects are distributed in space so as they cannot be captured by the dominant narratives and representational formats, focused on single outbursts of violence. In this context, slow violence occurs gradually, out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all, End of quote. In this context, the slow violence, however, is deeply entangled with 200 years of sustained, intensive extractivist practices in the Upper Silesian coal basin, especially those concerned with smelting heavy metals which sediment in human and more than human bodies over time. Whereas Nixon's slow violence aims predominantly to expose the long-term calamities wreaked by environmentally unsustainable practices of Western capitalism on the poorest social groups, the story of lead poisoning in the Upper Silesia points to a different yet interrelated type of slow violence, related to what I tentatively call post-socialist Anthropocene. The term builds upon the work of art historians Maya Folks and Ruben Folks, who have recently put forward the concept of the socialist Anthropocene to aptly show that the irreparable loss of species, habitats, cultures, traditions, and life, especially in the 20th century, was not only an effect of Western neocolonial practices fueled by modern capitalism, but also resulted from the Soviet Union's expansionist politics, organized around the implementation of 5-year plans to collectivize, industrialize, urbanize, and indeed modernize socialist territories. However, as the long-term effects of the epidemic of lead poisoning are felt well beyond the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and its effects are felt in the present, post-socialist Anthropocene seems to be much more accurate a term. In the remainder of my paper, I aim to navigate through the aspects of the lead poisoning epidemic as slow violence in the post-socialist Anthropocene, looking closely at two contemporary semi-fictional narratives of the 1975 events. Michał Jędryka's essay Ołowiane dzieci, zapomniana epidemia, The Leaden Children, A Forgotten Epidemic, from 2020, and Marta Fox's novel Moja ołowianko, klęknij na kolanko, My Leaden Lady, Get Down on Your Knees, from 2021. Although aimed at different audiences and written for different purposes, the two works follow the same performative strategy that I tentatively term remembering. The term, borrowed from the American philosopher and theoretical physicist Karen Barad, denotes various embodied practices that constantly reconfigure the past in order to posit new, more sustainable visions of the future. In both cases, the sedimentations of the epidemic of lead poisoning are remembered from the perspective of a different body, directly or indirectly linked to the events of 1975. Michał Jędryka's Leaden Children begin in the graveyard located in the vicinity of the now decommissioned non-ferrous metal steelworks in Szopienice, which was the source of lead poisoning, the 1975 lead poisoning. The narrator is attending the funeral of one of his primary school classmates who suddenly died of unknown cause a couple of years ago. Having met some of his colleagues at the ceremony, all afflicted by the 1975 lead poisoning, he realizes that members of his class are either dead, often suicidal, or suffer seemingly unrelated health conditions, bone illnesses, autoimmune diseases, depression. The narrator instantly establishes a link between the deteriorating health of his mates, their subsequent deaths, and the 1975 events. And I quote from Jędryka, "It is true, my classmates were already once disappearing from the classroom, from the class register, from school. Contemporary graves recalled the disappearing children from many years ago, the disappearing class," end of quote. Thus, Jędryka clearly remembers the story of the epidemic of lead poisoning from a contemporary perspective, to show that the epidemic has not waned, but rather continues well into the contemporary. What is especially important in the context of my talk, Jędryka carefully remembers the trajectory of lead particles through human and more than human bodies. As he makes clear, lead poisoning epidemic materializes through 4 micron large molecules which form a lead dust, a byproduct of smelting heavy metal ores. The molecules are then transmitted predominantly by 3 elemental forces, air, water, and earth, which work as elemental orientations. Lead dust is carried by the wind and inhaled. Lead dust, however, is invisible and odorless, and may either be transmitted by the pulmonary alveoli to the blood or permeate the human body directly through skin. Lead dust also pollutes water and soil, and as it bioaccumulates in plants and animals, it may also permeate the human body through the digestive tract. Once lead dust molecules penetrate the human body, they sediment in all tissues, especially in bones and nervous systems. However, the story of lead poisoning, as Jędryka makes clear, does not end here. Even when the molecules are removed from the system, they have already caused multiple cell mutations or even changed the genome of the afflicted, which may cause the unrelated conditions experienced by Jędryka and his former classmates. Perhaps they are even responsible for the contemporary elevated level of alcohol and drug use and criminal activity registered by the authorities in the affected area. Thus, lead poisoning is a perfect example of chemical violence, which, according to Nixon, is driven inward, somatized into cellular dramas of mutation that, particularly in the bodies of the poor, remain largely unobserved, undiagnosed, and untreated, end of quote. If it weren't for Wadowska-Król's screening tests and her determination to conduct them against all the odds, the violent lead poisoning would have gone unregistered, disguised as different dispersed, more or less acute cases of anemia. Apart from the elemental story of lead particles, Jędryka remembers parallel human stories. One is concerned with the investigation conducted by Jędryka's fictional teenage self into the disappearing members of his class. The other recounts the story of Wadowska-Król conducting her screening tests and diagnosing patients. The two stories throw into relief two specific aspects of lead poisoning epidemic as slow violence, which extend Rob Nixon's concept. On the one hand, the investigation shows a paradoxical imperceptibility of the epidemic of lead poisoning as slow violence, specific to Polish social life under the Soviet influence. As you can imagine, a teenage investigation, and you can see the investigator on the slide, clearly inspired by detective stories popular among teenagers in the 1970s, does not conclude in finding one villain responsible for the children's suffering. However, the young detective discovers something more important from my perspective. His witnesses are certain that the children's illness is related to the negative steelworks impact. And I quote from Jędryka, the steelworks is poisoning us, but it also gives us bread, end of quote. Slow violence may not only be negative, but also crucial for human, in this case, working class livelihoods. Thus, Lead and Children does not center around the negative effects of slow violence in the post-socialist Anthropocene. The other story told by Jędryka clearly suggests that living in the Soviet Empire, especially in its borderlands, also generated its own modes of mitigating slow violence. This was made possible by what the Estonian post-colonial scholar Epp Ennes, following Jacques Rancière, has recently named everyday dissensus. In her recent work, Soviet Post-Colonial Studies, A View from the Western Borderlands, the term points to, and I quote, instances of alternate non-Soviet modes of thinking and being, experienced as such in everyday life, end of quote, characteristic of East and Central European countries under the Soviet influence. Those instances ripped through the tightly woven fabric of heavily regulated life practices defined by Soviet regime and made space for the reorganization in the established order of things. Yet, as Annes makes clear, the everyday dissensus in the borderlands of Soviet Empire did not materialize merely in mass-scale events and demonstrations in the streets, nor was it tantamount to clandestine anti-Soviet activities such as distributing leaflets or displaying the banned emblems of the pre-Soviet states. The dissensus was inextricably linked to the most mundane spheres of life under the Soviet rule. For instance, as practice of summer homing, popular in the Baltics, where people would go to their summer houses where the pre-Soviet emblems were very much alive. As Jędryka's work evidences, everyday dissensus did not require disconnection from the dominant regime, as Wadowska-Król would conduct her medical test using a particular code to mark a code system of crosses after the name of a patient, as she was not able to use the name lead poisoning in the official documents. Thus, and this practice could be read as everyday dissensus, as it helped Wadowska-Król infiltrated by a member of the secret police who could not find anything suspicious in her registers. As Jędryka makes clear, such practice, if it hadn't been for such practices, Wadowska-Król would have not been able to succeed in her campaign for the relocation of the affected children sent to hospitals and preventoria and their families from the contaminated area. Whereas Jędryka's work focuses predominantly on the entanglement of the physical and socio-political effects of lead poisoning epidemic as slow violence, Martha Fox's novel, My Leaden Lady, Get Down on Your Knees, accounts for mental and emotional long-term effects of lead contamination, as well as specific effects of the epidemic of lead poisoning on women. Not surprisingly so, as the novel is overtly targeted at teenage girls and young adult women. Whereas Jędryka's work remembers the 1975 epidemic of lead poisoning through the experience of the afflicted, Fox's novel remembers it from the perspective of Weronika, who, unlike Jędryka's narrator, is not directly related to the 1975 events. Weronika is a 17-year-old girl of affluent background whose doctor parents suddenly decide to go to the United States for a 2-month prestigious internship. Due to her recent mental health problems, most likely suicidal episodes triggered by the recent death of her beloved grandmother, Weronika is neither allowed to go with her parents nor stay at home alone. Thus, she is sent to spend the summer with an 80-year-old friend of her grandmother's who happens to be Jolanta Wadowska-Król. Weronika is aware that this forced stay is intended to put her under control, but she cannot fathom the link between her family and the famous doctor, clearly indicated by the photographs hanging all around her new home. When Wadowska-Król asks her to organize her private archive relating to the epidemic of lead poisoning, Weronika embarks on a private investigation to explain her relation to the doctor, through which the reader is supposed to establish the relationship between the narrator and the lead poisoning epidemic. The private investigation, which drives the plot of My Leaden Lady, clearly aims to show that the epidemic of lead poisoning is not only it's not only triggering health effects, but is also about transgenerational trauma, which predominantly affects women. As it turns out, in the course of Weronika's investigation, in the 1970s, her grandmother worked as a psychiatrist in the local psychiatric hospital in Szopienice, very close to the non-ferrous steelworks. Most likely due to the exposure to lead dust, she lost her first child, who died 3 days after birth. Several years later, in similar circumstances, she lost a daughter, Weronika's mother, twin sister. The trauma of losing a child perpetuated in the next generation, as the narrator's mother also lost a daughter, Weronika's sister, officially in cot death. Thus, the narrator's mental health problems are also most likely the after effects of lead poisoning. The matrilinear or transgenerational trauma uncovered in the course of the narrator's private investigation shows the effects of the epidemic of lead poisoning as slow violence, specifically on female bodies and mental health. As Fox's novel makes clear, the effects were inextricably linked to the typical Silesian matriarchal system described by Silesian writers and scholars such as Michał Smolosz and Grażyna Kubicka-Heller, among others. As Silesian men were mostly absent working long shifts in coal mines and steelworks, women, usually mothers and grandmothers, dominated the family life, making virtually all the decisions concerning the everyday life of the family. The domination, however, was both a blessing and a curse, as it was women who bore the psychological burden of their husbands' devastating work, as they usually became young widows who had to take after their often sick children. Moreover, their domination in the sphere of family life did not translate into agency in the public realm, still dominated by men. Thus, Fox's novel shows that the epidemic was entangled with another type of slow violence, which Nixon defines as a violence of closed doors, referring to systemic limitations to political and social opportunities, especially for women. This type of slow violence is made clear in the story of Wadowska Król, recounted by Fox's narrator, Wadowska Król, not being able to complete her PhD, written on the basis of the results of her screening tests, even after her auto-censoring her work. However, My Leaden Lady shows that the Silesian matriarchal system could also work as a strategy for mitigating the effects of the epidemic of lead poisoning. In one of the scenes of the novel, Wadowska Król gives a motivational speech of sorts to the all-women personnel of her clinic, which draws on their shared experience of slow violence. The speech, and you can see the speech in the slide, clearly alludes to a famous speech delivered by the first secretary, Edward Gierek, in 1971, the famous Pomożecie, will you help me speech? In Fox's novel, therefore, Wadowska Król's success in mitigating the effects of the epidemic of lead poisoning is presented as not only due to the everyday dissensus, but also through the solidarity of women based on similar experiences of slow violence, as eloquently analyzed, for instance, by Marta Tomczak through feminist theories of Silvia Federici. However, I'd like to point out here that the alliance of women, as represented by Fox's novel, is based on what Elizabeth Povinelli, after Saidiya Hartman and Paul Gilroy, terms the politics of lower frequency, by which she means provisional ways marginalized and oppressed groups operate within the post-extractive landscapes. Local, multiple, and dispersed sites of resilience that have not been strategically codified or integrated. The politics of lower frequency can be read as a model to be remembered by the readers, which is evidenced by the ending of My Leaden Lady, inspired by Wadowska Król's story and the extraordinary feat of women as mitigating the effects of the lead poisoning epidemic. Veronika decides to become a campaigner for environmental justice so that the lead epidemic do not happen again in the future. Thus, the two works that I analyzed here can be read as remembering, in the sense that they not only show the negative, critically show the negative effects of lead poisoning epidemic, but also show they open vistas for more hopeful and more sustainable post-extractive futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Mateusz, for your speech. I must say, this paper is quite personal to me, as well as the next one, who will be presented by two scholars from Silesian University, Marta Tomczak and Paweł Tomczak. Marta Tomczak, she is a literary scholar. She works at the Faculty of Humanities of the University of Silesia in Katowice. She deals with the environmental history of coal, the phenomenon of environmental natural industry in culture, and the literature of the Holocaust. Author of 5 monographs and scientific articles, and team member, impact of long-term emission of pollutants, environmental, health and socio-cultural effects of non-ferrous metallurgy. She also directs the project Exhibitions and Speculative Fictions on the Past and the Future of Coal in the Decarbonization Culture, collecting interviews in artists and curators. Paweł Tomczak, he is also a literary scholar, works at the very same faculty. He's an author of Literary Capitalism, Images of Economic Abstractions in Polish Literature of the second half of the 19th century, published in Katowice in 2018. He deals with industrial literature and environmental history of the Upper Silesian coal basin. He is a team member of the, it's a research group, am I right? Impact of long-term emission of pollutants, environmental health, and socio-cultural effects of non-ferrous metallurgy I mentioned before. So the floor is yours. I'm sorry, I must also say what's the title of your speech. It is Hermeneutics of Life in a Continuous Industrial Catastrophe, the case of the Upper Silesia coal basin. Please.
Thank you very much. I will start reading. The Upper Silesian coal basin was one of Europe's most important industrial regions. In the 1980s, it was the site of an ecological disaster caused by hard coal mining and the concentration of heavy industry in small area. Due to the 2 centuries of industrialization in the coal field, a large part of the area was occupied by slag heaps and industrial plants. Areas for development and other human activities had to be located on small pieces of free land. One of the forms of development in these areas was allotment gardens. We would like to discuss them in the paper because we see in them the hermeneutics of life in the space of industrial disaster. Hermeneutics here is uncertain and prone to errors because acting in the field of disaster is always subject to risk and failure. Allotment gardens began to appear in the last 3 decades of the 19th century in Germany and in England. They were intended to provide workers with additional food. Over time, they also became an essential way of spending free time, of which workers at the end of the century had slightly more than in the initial phase of industrialization. One of the definitions of allotment gardens is as follows. Allotments are a very specific type of garden, usually a small size, not attached to a dwelling. They are cultivated by their tenant and family for individual consumption of the produce of the yield. Flowers, herbs, berry bushes, or fruit-bearing trees may also add to their harvest. With or without sheds, small gardens are visible along rail lines, most prominently in Germany. So allotment gardens are located some distance from the house. They are not home gardens, typical, for example, for garden cities. The plants from the garden were not intended for sale. The gardens were intended to support only individual consumption. Finally, in gardens were sheds and other places where people could shelter from rain or sun. Friedrich Engels, in his youthful book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, 1844, outlines a utopian picture of the lives of workers in the pre-industrial era. And he wrote, so the workers vegetated throughout a possibly comfortable existence, leading a righteous and peaceful life in all piety and probity. And their material position was far better than of their successors. They did not need to overwork. They did no more than they chose to do, and yet earned what they needed. They had leisure for helpful work in garden or field, work which in itself was recreation for them. So Engels. By working in the garden, workers could become strong, well-built people, said Engels. Throughout Engels' work, this image of the worker will oppose the sick and poor workers of heavy industry and the inhabitants of industrial cities. Allotment gardens were one of the answers to an increasingly current social problems in the second half of the 19th century. Improving the physical and moral condition of the working class played a significant role in the dream of harmonizing capital and labor. This could provide workers access to the land, enabling peasant contact with the soil, which would bind the worker back to it, so the worker could not look for work elsewhere. Furthermore, allotment gardens next to flats were an essential element that connected working class communities. They were another way of being together in a garden not separated from other parcels, forcing social contacts with neighboring gardens. This paper will focus on allotment gardens in the industrial region, primarily in Upper Silesia. Before the First World War, allotment gardens were established in the coal basin in Chorzów, Katowice, and Giszowiec, now part of Katowice. And during the interwar years, also in Ruda Śląska and Wełnowiec, also district of Katowice. The authors of anniversary volume recapitulating interwar experiences with creating allotment gardens notice differences in individual voivodeships. There's no shortage of land for new projects in Wielkopolska or in Pomerania. However, in Upper Silesia, the problem of access to land and its quality immediately arises. So they wrote, cities in this voivodeship had fewer areas and the land was mostly in private hands. Large coal and steel companies, which were less willing to lease land for allotment garden purposes. Moreover, if we consider that the obtained areas were most often covered with slag and ash, it will be possible to assess how much more difficult it was to obtain land for allotment gardens in Silesia than in other voivodeships. However, thanks to the tireless work of Silesian allotment gardeners, who dug the earth out from under the heaps and debris, beautiful allotment gardens were created in this voivodeship. Already in the interwar years, before the great acceleration in the second half of the 20th century, soil for allotment gardens had to be dug out from under heaps. However, the land was covered with successive ash layers in the post-war period. Antonina Leńkowa, Polish essayist and ecologist, author of a popular book, Sculpt Earth, recalls years later a visit to Chorzów, although not in allotment gardens, but on a state-owned farm. So she wrote it in 80s. In 1958, I was persuaded to participate in a Silesia tour organized by the Polish Soil Science Society. I remember a particular fact from this field trip that was brought to our attention. When we went near Zakłady Azotowe, nitrogen plants near Chorzów, at one point the bus stopped and everyone got out to see the freshly dug open pits in the fields of the state agriculture farm in Maciejkowice. These were quite deep, pits located several dozen steps from the road. When we reached them through the stubble, the view of the interior made a great impression on the visitors. On their walls, you could clearly see the border of lightly colored natural local soil, and above it, a gray layer of factory dust, 30 to 40 centimeters thick. This layer, which becomes thicker with every minute, day or year, consists of usually poisonous substances thrown out through the chimneys of industrial plants. Over 20 grams of dust per 1 square meter of surface fell on the stubble we were walking on then. So despite shifting the top layers with the bottom layers using a plough and other agricultural tools, this type of soil cannot produce good crops. While viewing the outcrops, we could see how the best soils of Silesia, located in this area, were buried under a thick cover of harmful dust. The ground where the plants are supposed to grow is covered with a thick layer of dust. Allotment gardens, located even closer to the coking plants and steelworks, had to be even more covered with dust. Many Silesian cities, such as Chorzów, Świętochłowice, Ruda Śląska, and Bytom, have been competing for years for priority in the ranking of falling industrial dust. Permissible standards were usually exceeded many times. In the post-war period, allotment gardens became even more popular in industrial areas, as they often gained the support of the management board of nationalized plants. Therefore, recreation areas for workers were established right next to industrial plants, for example, swimming pools, sport fields, and allotment gardens. Allotment gardens began to be granted to workers on a larger scale after the Second World War. They were created on land belonging to the large factories. The Polish People's Republic authorities used them to conduct policy towards their citizens and implement social or collective activities. Over time, workers' allotment gardens became a place of political utopia, closer to the ideals of local patriotism and nurturing its own family land. The growing popularity of gardens after the war was also associated with increased state social care for citizens. Allotment gardens were equipped with gyms, reading rooms, and swimming pools, all in order to strengthen control over workers' free time. A good reference material is Note Planning and Development of Plots in the Soviet Union, published in the monthly Działkowiec in 1979. The plot's layout, including the direction in which the shed is to be placed, is designed so carefully that the authors leaves no room for freedom to the users. This direction of plot management is also confirmed by the articles published in the magazine in the 70s and 80s. The provincial management of employees of workers' allotment gardens in Katowice was the largest allotment garden center in post-war Poland. It united 444 smaller centers with a total area of 2,457 hectares, which included, according to the calculation of the Działkowiec editorial team, as many as 59,700 individual gardens. Concerning this number, the amount of information provided to gardeners about the threats posed by the industry to gardening was surprisingly small. Only one such article appeared during the 2 decades of increasing ecological awareness in Poland in 1985. Its author wrote directly about the existence of a relationship between heavy metals emitted by heavy industry and the cultivation of plots located nearby. Therefore, he did not recommend growing vegetables such as carrots, parsley, beets, celery, radishes, lettuce, sorrel, spinach, and potatoes. Instead, he recommended growing fruit, currants, strawberries, white strawberries, and raspberries. Only tomatoes, cucumbers, pumpkins, and beans, all plants growing above the ground, were edible among the vegetables. He also attached great importance to washing vegetables and fruits. In unwashed plants, the content of heavy metals could be about 2 to 3 times higher than in washed vegetables, and in some, such as lettuce, it could be even higher than in the soil. He advised against grating the carrot and giving it to children in this form, so it could contain more lead than the juice. There was little and quite general information about allotment gardens in Silesia and Zagłębie in Działkowiec, that the industry caused problems such as air pollution or lowering of groundwater. But since their users were the same works employed by the neighboring steelworks or mine, they had to deal with problems they knew from work.
Writers wrote about allotment gardeners from entirely different perspectives. Andrzej Brycht, who came to Upper Silesia in the 1960s to prepare a report of the pokój steelworks in Ruda Śląska, wrote that the nearby fields were as red as horse hair from the glow of the blast furnaces. But he also wrote, allotment gardeners as much land as a spade can fit. There are gazebos as small as dog houses and bushes with leaves falling off. In summer, they are swarming with gooseberries black with coal, which falls like enteral, never melting snow. In 1951, Wilhelm Szewczyk mentioned that the land next to the Dębieńsko mine, that it was of good harvest lying at the foot of bare and boron heaps, which have already destroyed many mining plots, burned several dozen acres of fields, and destroyed many garden gazebos and sheds. Today, these heaps tower over the area of Czerwionka and thousands of people live around them in houses with gardens. Anna Cieplak also wrote about the allotment gardeners under the Charlotte heap located in Redłutowy, Wodzisław County, admiring their owner's creativity but not considering the environmental conditions of this settlement. The most moving images of the contamination of plots located near heavy industry were provided by Henryk Bereska, an author from Szopienice, where the non-ferrous metals smelter was situated until the beginning of the 21st century. His poem Maria's Garden talks about the action of eliminating gardens in Szopienice due to soil contamination. However, the title character, like many other Silesian gardeners, does not seem to notice the treat and lives as if despite it. Its quotation. And yet Maria built her gazebo from scratch. She planted chamomile, corian, and asters. She let the old men play cards and let the cats live in the house. She gave them somewhere to eat and a word of conversation. Bereska's poetry addresses a more general problem, the adaptation of allotment gardeners to the ecological catastrophe of Silesia in the second half of the 20th century. Taking it from today's perspective requires realizing that we are talking about both a process of slow but permanent and profound destruction of the earth by industry, but also about the process of countering on a particular scale. The victims of this destruction are most often employees of the most poisonous industrial plants who use plots of land belonging to the steelworks and mines where they work. The most extensive and most interesting destiny of this type of garden can be found in Ruda Śląska. The structure of the city, composed of many independent districts, reminds us of the industrial plants that once operated there. The Karol Charles mine and the Orzegów coking plant operated in the Orzegów district until the 1970s. The coking plant was particularly troublesome for the residents. When the wind blew from the direction of the coking plant, smoke and dust penetrated the apartments and allotment gardeners, making existence virtually impossible. The coking plant plays a definitely negative role in the residents' memories. A row of trees was planted to separate the gardeners from it, which became a protective belt. Residents in the gardeners closed to the coking plant did not grow crops, only chickens and rabbits. And where they grew tomatoes, they remembered to wash them thoroughly from dust before eating them. In this practice, nature, which should be healthy, is marked by dirt and contamination. But small gestures are intended to establish a boundary between dirty and clean nature. They are supposed to restore purity in the world of ecological catastrophe, which marks everything with the grayness of falling dust. The gardeners near Huta Pokój, a huge ironworks, are remembered entirely differently. There are located several hundred meters from the steelworks. Today, both fruits and vegetables grow there. As one of the owners, an over 80-year-old woman, said the proximity of working steelworks did not bother them. She grew Colabri lettuce and radishes in the garden, but today she doesn't produce anything because car-exhausted fumes make it impossible to grow anything. A similar approach can be found at allotment gardens located in the same district of Ruda Śląska between the coal mine heap and the zinc heap. For many years, people had to deal with its fires, which were as harmful to the land and crops as smoke from cooking plants. Research by modern anthropologists confirms the stable meaning of the word plot. It is an oasis of peace, not home, a place of rest where time flows differently. Our conversation with allotment gardeners from Ruda Śląska show the same meaning of this word. At the same time, they have their own grassroots awareness of living in an oasis at risk of disaster. A series of grassroots practices, such as limiting cultivation, fertilizing the land, and planting protective trees, in the past allowed them to control the disaster of at least a life in conditions of permanent and continuous catastrophe. However, the contemporary location of plots in the vicinity of closed mines and steelworks still creatures a terrifying picture. This image shows the thin line between human happiness and mortal danger. This threat may take the form not only of land and air contamination, but also of sinkholes. The sinkholes in Trzebinia appeared in allotment gardens, the cemetery, and the forest, but probably closing the allotment gardens was the most complex and least effective. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Marta and Paweł. Now we are leaving Upper Silesia, but we are staying in the coal mine regions. Our next speaker, Ivan Posilny, he born September 27th, 1994 in Ługańsk, Ukraine. He's a sociologist and PhD candidate at the Doctoral School of Social Sciences at the University of Warsaw. He possessed his master's degree in sociology and he gained it at Lancaster University in 2020. He possesses also a master's degree in applied sociology from Kharkiv National University, and his doctoral dissertation focuses on the official, educational, and media discourses of collective identity of the children and adults living in the Donbas People's Republic. He teaches the course Ethnicity and Identity in Donbas for bachelor and master Erasmus students at the University of Warsaw. Currently, he is involved in scientific research projects, including those commissioned by international organizations such as UNICEF, Plan International, focusing on the well-being of Ukrainian refugee children and adults in Europe, as well as internally displaced persons inside Ukraine. And Ivan will present us today the paper titled The Whole Industrial Inferno, the Donbas Industrial Disasters in the Post-Colonial Perspective. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And how do I switch the slides?
Just right, left, forward.
Let me try first.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it works. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So I would like to start my presentation with the following David Moore's quote. How extraordinarily post-colonial the societies of the former Soviet regions are, and how extraordinarily little we pay attention to this fact. And my today's presentation aims to pay a certain contribution to this discussion of Russian colonial politics in Ukraine. Russian colonialism in Donbass took a shape of various extractivist policies and practices which began back in the middle of 18th century with European settlers and continue today. However, today I will focus not on Russian colonialism itself, but on one of its embodiments, the industrial extractivist policy in Donbass, and how it has been narrated, or rather silenced, in the last 100 years, the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. The first part of this presentation, this paper, will focus on two periods of the Donbass forest industrialization, which determined the change of the Donbass environment and led to ecological disasters. The second part will discuss the public discourse of the Donbass industrialization in the Soviet period, with its tabooization of uncomfortable for the official ideology topics and events of technogenic disasters. And the third part explores the contemporary, or after 2014, public discourse of the Donbass colonial past and its emerging mechanisms of, let's say, remembering the industrial catastrophes of the 20th century. Let me proceed with saying that in March 2021, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Alexei Danilov, said this famous now in Ukraine quote, "There is no such thing as Donbass. It is a dangerous narrative incited by the Russian Federation." So he refused to confirm that Donbass actually exists. And you also can see the screenshot I took from the Ukrainer website. It's the website which collects ethnographic materials from all around Ukraine. And you also can see that there is no mention of Donbass here. Such an ultimate rejection to recognize the existence of Donbass, which is a popular narrative now in Ukraine, has deep colonial roots. And let me speak about that for a second. While the other Ukrainian regions formed historically prior to the 18th century, Donbass land had no regular settlements until the middle of the century and was regarded by geographers of that time as wild field. So you can see on this slide that wild field was a large part of Ukrainian land and Donbass was just a small piece of it. Ukrainian historians from Donbass suggest the year of 1721 as the date of discovering Donbass. And the word discovering is very interesting, actually. So it is connected with the region's rich fossil fuel deposits. You can see on this slide, the black parts are the ones with the rich fossil fuel deposits in Donbass. In fact, it is coal, so the extractivist colonial logic that gave the name for the region, Donetsk Coal Basin, or in short, Donbass. And let me just reiterate this. While other industrial regions, at least many industrial regions around the world, they have the pre-industrial history, Donbass does not have the pre-industrial history. It is a product of Russian extractivist policy and Russian basically aim to use the region as a source. So this is the starting point of the modern history of Donbass, let's say, this middle of 18th century, which is also the beginning of the drastic changes to the region's environment, about which I will be speaking further. And also, I don't see the time changes, so I don't know how much time I have. Okay, yes, interrupt me. So yeah, I'll move on and say that one English journalist who traveled to Donbass some time ago, 160 years ago actually, it was the end of 19th century, he called what he saw in Donbass the whole familiar industrial inferno. So the topic of my presentation actually stems from that quote. And it is true, because in just a few decades, Donbass steppe which was populated very scarcely, transformed into a hotspot of the European industrial production. The produce was going to Russian Empire, and the profits were going to European countries, Belgium, France, Germany, Poland as well. The Donbas corporate towns, or monotowns, how we call them in Ukraine, were growing all around Donbas, driving massive inflow of labor migrants into the region. So this first stage of Donbas industrialization, the so-called European period, formed the modern industrial landscape of the region, and the Soviet vector remained the same, featuring the emergence of many metallurgical and chemical plants, opening of new coal mines, etc. And what's important, the outcomes of the Soviet extractivist period of Donbas for the region's environment are best described in an amazing book. It's a collective book called Labor, Exhaustion and Success, the Donbas Monotowns, where the authors point out the manipulative Soviet official discourse, which represented Donbas as a region which successfully overcomes natural limitations, while the natural limitations were the product of the extractivist policy. So the other negative effects you can see on the slide, and I will mention more of them. So the negative effects on Donbas environment included the pollution of air, the upper layers of underground waters, soil degradation, spoiled deep landslides, and radioactivity. So basically, when we speak about Gurny Shlonsk, Upper Silesia, the outcomes for nature were quite similar, I would say. So I will not stop on that very much. I'll just say that it was popular in this exclusionary academic discourse in the Soviet Union of that period, 1970s, 80s, to call Donbas lands as badlands or wastelands. We could also hear the word wastelands from yesterday's discussions about Holodomor. To give a sense of the scale of the problem, I'll just say that Donbas has got around 900 large industrial plants, which include coal mines, metallurgical plants, thermal power stations, etc. Although the majority of these plants were shut down before 2014 or as a result of Russian invasion of 2014, still they pollute the environment dramatically. Now, let me quote a famous Ukrainian artist and researcher from Donbas, Daria Tsimbalyuk, who calls for studying the Russian imperial core, as well as the ways in which it has shaped regions, lands, and ecosystems through military geological entanglements in order to understand the depth of the damage that is done. And indeed, it is hard to understand the damage done because the region is partly occupied and, well, for the last 10 years, any kind of research was wasn't possible there. But even though it is without a shadow of a doubt that the forced industrialization and the Russian unprovoked aggression in Donbas had a cumulative negative effect on Donbas environment. And I will move on now. My second half of the paper is devoted to this discursive construction of Donbas identity in the Soviet and post-Soviet periods, and how industrial catastrophes simply do not exist there, how environmental issues are not discussed there at all. So the industrialization of Donbas in the first decades of the Soviet rule in Ukraine was very important for the imperial project. So it was a popular claim to say that Donbas is the heart of Russia. And the newly established USSR needed modernization. And the driver of that modernization, of the heart, actually was foreseen for Donbas. Therefore, the early Soviet propaganda needed this discursive driver for people to move to Donbas because, well, not so many people, even in pretty poor living conditions all around the Russian Empire, not many of them wanted to move to Donbas and work at steel plants and coal mines. This kind of a driver that created the cultural even trend for industrialization became a 1931 Dziga Vertov's film, enthusiasm, the symphony of Donbas. And you can, when you hear the word symphony, you actually think about high culture, right? So this is an interesting paradoxic observation. And also, if you pay attention to the year when the film was released, 1931, which also can refer to our yesterday's discussions about Holodomor. So the film became an important element of constructing the identity of Donbas as a region attractive for people to move in, even though, in fact, it was not, because of all the living conditions, which were simply terrible and irresistible for many people. The death toll of those who worked in mines were high, but also of those who were at home suffering from diseases. So the film actually depicts the region as an organism, as a beating heart of the Soviet Union, which the Soviet people can see and even hear. It's actually the second film in the world with the audio, with the really recorded audio, like on site. The focus of the film on masculinity and hard physical work of men from different Soviet republics who are conquering and changing the nature symbolized this utopian Soviet project on the one hand, but also went along with the global romanticism about industrialization, urbanization. Enthusiasm and other elements of public discourse of Donbas at that time also contributed to the construction of the heroic image of Donbas miners, who were seen as, like a Donbas miner was seen as Prometheus, who is giving light to people's households by digging, oops, okay, I'm too excited, by digging coal and basically delivering it to the power plants which will transform it to electrical power. So the film puts these industry workers in the setting of industrial plants. So they work there, they produce a new Soviet socialist region. And the film completely disregards the living conditions, which, as I mentioned, were quite bad. A peculiar fact is that in 2018, a Ukrainian film director released a documentary called The Cacophony of Donbas, criticizing the Dziga Vertov's film and basically re-narrating the story that Dziga Vertov told. Okay, 4 decades later, after 1931, Donbas got into the focus of the Soviet cinematography again, but the image of the region was completely different. A Ukrainian culturologist, Lesia Kulchinska, called Brezhnev's period, about which I'm talking about now, as it was depicted in the films about Donbas, a frozen reality where nothing changes despite of all the effort. To translate this stagnation into the environmental context, I suggest to explore a 1977 photo book, The Donbas Miners. This is a peculiar case of the Soviet propaganda machinery in making, in particular in the way it treats the Donbas environmental problems. In fact, in 1970s, ecology became a major issue for the region. On the one hand, the upper layers of coals were completely exhausted and digging up more and more was just too costly for Soviet authorities. And on the other hand, the industrial diseases were becoming a more prominent problem to face. However, the public discourse disregarded all of these problems and constructed an alternative reality where these issues did not exist. The photo book features the photographs about the region aimed for tourists, and also it has some text. It introduces the region to people from the Soviet Union who don't know much about that, even though it is hard to believe that people in the Soviet Union could know little about Donbas. So the book represents Donbas as the improved land, improved by industry. You can see a quote from the book, and I will add a few more quotes, which are very peculiar. So the book represents Donbas as delicate masts of the power lines, a sea full of electric lights, bright constellations of the industrial towns, towns grown from scratch in the middle of the sunburned steppe, blooming miners' region, etc. So these oxymoronic discursive constructs of the industrial, this is the oxymoronic constructs of the so-called industrial nature, basically. What they were trying to do is to represent Donbas as the new nature, the nature to zero, which is caused by the industrial changes. Now let me proceed quickly to the next slide. For the last 10 years, Donbas was occupied by the Russian forces, and it has been split in two parts. The light green is the non-occupied part, and the dark green is the occupied part. Now, of course, the situation changed after the Russian full-scale invasion. But my point is that, obviously, it is impossible to even think about ecological disasters when the region is occupied. So people who basically live under occupation or who live under the Ukrainian-controlled territories did not produce the narrative about the ecological problems of the latest decade. However, the Russian aggression has driven the public discourse of Donbas to discuss the colonial heritage of the region dramatically. So you can see on the slides that these books are all about Donbas history, and they were basically produced in the last 2, 3, 4 years. But I want to focus on the film Atlantis, and this is the last point of my presentation. It's Valentin Vasenovich's film released in 2018, and it's a dystopian film which picks up on the most relevant themes of the contemporary public discourse of Donbas. You can see that there are more films released about Donbas in recent years, but Atlantis, as for me, is probably the most interesting because it depicts future, but at the same time discusses past of Donbas. So the film discusses the future of Donbas after Ukraine wins the war against Russia in 2025. We see the region through the eyes of the main character, a war veteran suffering from PTSD, and his post-war Donbas has become a buffer zone between Ukraine and Russia and is now uninhabited. The rivers and soil are poisoned, the coal mines are flooded. So this cinematographic narrative is pretty close to reality as it is for today. And the director envisages this for future as well. What goes between the lines is the reasons for this to happen. So the basically it's the post-colonial approach to understanding the Donbas environmental issues, and it's criticism of the Russian colonial politics in Donbas with its two main embodiments, industry and the war. In fact, one of the main themes of the film is emptiness and exhaustion of the main character, but also of the land, of the territory. This is the result of post-colonial perception of the region and its people as a resource. Nowadays, Russia still sees and uses Donbas as a resource, though rather not through coal mining, but ideologically. And finally, I'll just say that if in the Soviet discourse of Donbas, it was represented as the industrial region emerged on sunburned steppes, in Vasenovich's film, the land is war-burned and not sunburned anymore. So it is a pretty opposite image. Also, if you look at these pictures, the left one is taken, it's a screenshot from the Dziga Vertov's 1931 film Enthusiasm, and on the right you see the Atlantis screenshot. And these films represent very different perspectives on what Donbas is and what industry for Donbas meant. And you can see the basically binary oppositions of a lot of action in Dziga Vertov's film versus no action. In the Atlantis film, you can see a lot of dynamics versus almost no dynamics. The Atlantis film is very static. The similarity is that there was no color, obviously, in 1931 film, and there is still pretty little color in Atlantis film. The colors are usually gray and blue. Also, the Enthusiasm film did not have the main character it had a collective image of miners represented, but no main character. Whereas Atlantis has a main character, as I mentioned, the war veteran, who is undergoing severe psychological, emotional difficulties because of the industrial past of Donbass and the war. So, yeah, I hope to continue this discussion maybe in a Q&A session. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan. It was very interesting perspective. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Irina Morozova. She's a historian of the USSR, modern and contemporary Central and Inner Asia. After obtaining her PhD from Lomonosov Moscow State University in 2002, she continued her academic career in the Netherlands at Leiden University, as well as the University of Amsterdam. And then in Germany, where she had position at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg, at Humboldt University in Berlin, Leibniz Institute for South and Eastern European Studies in Regensburg, and University of Göttingen. Currently, she is a Privatdozent at the University of Regensburg. Her recent habilitation project was on economic reform and public debate in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Mongolia in the 80s and 90s of 20th century. And today, Irina will present the paper about the Tengiz catastrophe of 1985-1986 in the midst of perestroika reform. The floor is yours. Yeah, this is the clicker.
And
Forward, backward.
okay. Good morning, and thank you very much for being present here just this early morning at the third day of the conference. And my gratitude, of course, go to the organizers for this excellent program. Nothing has been so telling about the malfunctioning of the Soviet economic and political system as the role of technological hazards and disasters. The cases of the 1980s happened to be better covered in a way. The recent scholarship on Central Asia, this is exactly the region about which I'm going to talk to you today, touches on technological, scientific, industrial, and environmental problems of the cotton industry and RLC regression to the Soviet nuclear program, though they surprisingly omitted catastrophes in oil and natural gas industries. And this paucity of research echoes the silences of these catastrophes in media. Soviet media, the media of independent Kazakhstan, and the Western media only briefly mentioned the explosion that happened on the Tengiz oil field in Western Kazakhstan in 1985. This happened in the proximity of the city Atirau, announced by the former president Nazarbayev as the oil capital of Kazakhstan, and it was renamed in October 1991, previously called Guriev. Guriev is situated to the south of the Ural Mountains between Astrakhan and Mangyshlak Peninsula on the Caspian Sea coast, on the river Ural, and next to the basin of the river Ember and neighboring Karakalpakstan and Turkmenistan. Thus, it has gained strategic importance over its few centuries of history of competition, conquest, and revolt. The city was integrated into the Ural province of the Russian Empire, together with practically the whole northeast Caspian basin in the second half of the 19th century, and it became a typical example of the competition of a few quasi-imperial projects. The territorial administrative division followed the reports on geography, natural resources, and ethnography delivered by the imperial geographers and scholars. Next to being a strategic fort in Russia's expansion to Central Asia, as well as famous for its fishing industries, Guriev acquired new industrial and commercial importance due to its oil reserves, discovered by the expedition of Grigory Grum-Grzymailo in 1889-1890. The participants of the expedition acquired exclusive ownership rights over the exploitation of oil reserves on the river Emba from Alexander III in 1891. In order to provide for the resources development, they sold part of the mines to the Dutch-British oil company Royal Dutch Shell in 1909. Since 1911, British capital and engineering was already contributing significantly to the development of Russia's Caspian oil industries, mainly around Baku, but also in Guriev. Before the World War I, the exploitation of the Caspian hydrocarbon resources had already taken the form of a consortium of transnational companies in which the nobles, the Rothschilds, Royal Dutch Shell, and other companies played a notable role. The transnational actors negotiated and came to agreements with imperial administration. However, in 1917, they all confronted and lost to the Bolsheviks, who categorically denied capital and legal ownership of these entities. In 1924, Guriev became the part of a Kazakh autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, and the delimitation of 1924 divided, in fact, these resources among a couple of republics. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and later Karakalpakstan happens to be within the territory of Uzbekistan. To discover, investigate, and exploit oil reserves of the Emba Basin, the corporate trust Embaneft was founded in 1922 in Moscow, and this, of course, represented a classical pattern of external colonial control. On this photo, you can see a very just a short period in the history of Soviet Central Asia with the introduction of the Latin alphabet. In 1929, when the inept policy came to a halt and forced industrialization started, the headquarters of the Embaneft were dislocated to Guriev. While working in the local archive, also with photo documentation, you see how some archivists just selected and categorized the photos of the oil rigs. They basically put it together, the oil rig, before the October coup d'etat in 1917 and the one in 1922, and in order to show some kind of deterioration in technologies. This slide I included thinking of the previous speaker in 1922 during the evacuation. The oil engineering plants named for Petrovsky were moved from Donbass to Guriev. And on 18 May 1943, the first oil refinery in Kazakhstan started operating, and the draft plan of the plant was based on the US technology and equipment obtained by the USSR via the Lend-Lease Act and delivered to Guriev via Iran. And again, this photo archive in Guriev from the 1970s, you see just written on, at the top, Ustanovka Guriev from Sesha in a way like with some kind of pride of by local archivists. Still, despite the Cold War restrictions, the 1950s, 1960s, there were state capital investment into the Soviet scientific and industrial branches responsible for investigating the Caspian hydrocarbon resources. Just as in Imperial Russia, the Soviet government had to rely largely on the scientific knowledge of the subject. The Soviet scientists in physical geography, geology, and geophysics knew that their function was to draft projects for the authorities. In these drafts, they utilized the USSR's geographical map that they themselves sketched. Their geological and geophysical mapping principally differed from the political administrative mapping and reflected, in a way, the imperial map of the Ural province. Thus, on the Soviet geophysical map, Western Kazakhstan and its hydrocarbon resources were a part of the so-called Caspian oil and gas province that encompassed the Caspian Depression and North Caspian Sea. The geophysical mapping was supposed to be decisive in administration of expeditions and resource management. However, financing and management of the institutions where these scientists work imposed completely different political mentality, where the division of resources at republican and local levels. More often ministerial and intra-institutional politics, as well as personal alliances and confrontations, impacted and framed this competitive field of oil and natural gas exploitation. The 1960s and to a greater extent the 1970s marked in a way like slowing down of the development of the oil industry around Guryev, as you see this photo of the 1970s illustrating camels as a transportation means near the oil rig. The investments streamed in developing Western Siberian oil and gas field, and the budget redistributions among the provinces of Kazakhstan show the lowest percentage of the province of Guryev, and the party Congress archives depict continuous criticism against the poor capacity utilization and allocation by the province due to the structural impediments for the development, like, in a way, the engineered lack of capacities. The moment to prioritize the oil industries around Guryev came in 1979, the zenith of the Iranian Revolution, and with the Soviet troops' march into Afghanistan. These events temporarily cancelled some preliminary trade agreements between Iran and the USSR while increasing oil prices internationally. That year, it was announced that Soviet geologists, mostly members of the Siberian Geophysics Expedition and Saratov Neft Geophysica, so not those located in Guryev, discovered considerable oil reserves on subsalt deposit 160 kilometers to the southeast of Guryev, but we understand that this data had been available before. These reserves became known as the Tengiz, so the Kazakh name was given to the field. Tengiz, a hydronym in Turkic languages meaning sea, big lake, oil reserves. After Tengiz was finally identified as having newly discovered oil reserves, the development of the Kazakhstani oil industry was expected to reach a new level. Kunaev, the long-lasting first secretary of the Kazakhstani Communist Party, in December 1982, he was announcing the list of the best-performing enterprises of the Republic, and to a great surprise, Neft was listed the first, while previously it had been always evaluated as the least and poorly performing enterprise in the Republic. Politically, Kunaev listed Neft due to his knowledge of the plans to invest heavily in Kazakhstani hydrocarbon sector. He was very aware of the very much disturbing statistics, even of some drops in oil production in the USSR of for these years, and in the ideas and in the intention and decision reached to invest in Western Kazakhstani oil and natural gas fields. And here you can see the statistics for 1988. The capital investment growth for Kazakhstan was enormous, also in comparison with other republics and at the all-union level. And we understand that this capital investment went into the hydrocarbon sector. In 1982, nevertheless, when Kunaev was also celebrating his 70th birthday with top-ranking governmental medals and honors, he could hardly just predict what would also happen to his tenure in a couple of years with the explosion of the Tengiz field, that he would not be capable to report successfully on the fulfillment of the 11th five-year plan, and he also could not predict that Nursultan Nazarbayev, basically acting as his secretary and particularly helpful in preparing and signing the decrees on energy resources, would take the lead of independent Kazakhstan and then would even surpass his predecessors' remarkably long tenure. On 23rd June 1985, well number 37 of the Tengiz subsalt deposit, which belonged to Emboneft, but also partly to the industrial enterprise Nizhnevolsk Neft, run from Volgograd, explode. As a result of the explosion and the fountain, oil, hydrogen sulfide, and other toxic gases were emitted into the atmosphere. The burning oil, together with the burning metal equipment, created a huge cloud of toxic smoke over the well field. And according to the awkward official reports and media, the elimination of the fire took 399 days, as if it's possible to say so much precisely. The Soviet government covered this catastrophe up, and Nazarbayev's government never publicly investigated it. There are a couple of films, one produced by Kazakh Film, and another is an anonymous film available even on YouTube. I will briefly sketch the last one. It details the geological and technological complexity of the drilling and the efforts of various specialists and workers from all over the USSR to extinguish the fire. Intriguingly, without any commentary, the cameraman shows foreign specialists in uniforms guiding the work, treating the Soviet engineers in a way like in a colonial mat, in fact, commanding and intimidating them. The causes of the catastrophe were officially announced as technical failures. The film has a very clear touch of propaganda as it utilizes music and songs of the late socialist bard tradition to accent the workers' heroism. Nevertheless, it is clear from the video that workers are largely helpless, poorly equipped, and lacking knowledge or strategy while facing the catastrophe. The working conditions are obviously abysmal. A number of unsuccessful attempts were made to fight the fire with water, salt solution, and by dragging the metal, with tractors and handmade equipment out of the fire. The commentator condemns these methods as traditional, unsuitable. At a certain point, a tank, T-54, shot into the well. The shooting provided clear access to the orifice, but the burning fountain became stronger and straighter, reaching 200 meters in height. Here on this photo you exactly see that stage. Another attempt to battle the blaze was made and involved the construction of a heavy locking armature that had to be put into the burning well from a distance in order to attempt to close it. The first attempt to lock the well was unsuccessful. Then the film mentions the following attempts, which proved to be successful, although neither the film nor open source provides any detail, but I will. The film also provides little information regarding how authorities in charge dealt with the catastrophe afterwards, before the official date of this liquidation on 27th July 1986. Well, the film doesn't mention it. There were certainly deaths during the efforts to put out the blaze. People who participated in eliminating the fire were also the survivors who put their lives at risk, but also they faced long-lasting consequences on their health. At the end of the film, the commentator details that the first anti-heat protection clothing for the workers turned out to be insufficient. Other open sources contend that during attempts to water the fire, workers fell into the holes of boiling water beneath the earth. We are in the possession of a diary of Valery Krevsky, renowned Soviet scientist and specialist on oil, a vice president of the International Congress or specialist on oil. He occupied the post of the first deputy minister for oil in the USSR in 1988, and was appointed to lead the headquarters on the liquidation of the Tengiz catastrophe on the field. At first glance, his diary is full of numerous technical details about the disaster. Supposedly, it sheds light on politics and conflicts around it, but troublingly, it's a memoir. Furthermore, the technical information therein is also open to various interpretations. The author states that there was a proposal to liquidate the disaster by means of underground nuclear explosion. Considering Igorevsky's previous experiments and research, it is hard to dismiss his insights. On the other hand, his claim that such a method was quick and safe, this is a quotation, raises eyebrows. Igorevsky details the plans to execute such a nuclear explosion. The author articulates his regret that the staff could not execute this plan due to the moratorium on the usage of nuclear tests announced by Gorbachev on 29 July 1985. Then there was a long period of very unsuccessful attempts to deal with the catastrophe in a way like anticipating the end of the moratorium, but the moratorium was prolonged since 1st January 1986, and then the Chernobyl catastrophe on 26 April 1986 happened, and nuclear test stops. And Igorevsky starts complaining. Obviously, not all the mismanagement of Tengiz that he explains by the attention diverted to dealing with the Chernobyl disaster, the attention also from the Ministry for Oil Industry, the Ministry for Defense. He also explains it with a lot of local mismanagements, revealing that the workers working on the fields at the initial stage of the catastrophes were not even provided with water cooks, refrigerators, and kitchens. It is very remarkable that Igorevsky does not mention the exact date of the signing of the contracts with a foreign company, because somehow exactly after the Chernobyl catastrophe, he happened suddenly to be very much aware of exactly which kind of blow-up prevention equipment and from which company to order, and the companies from which this equipment was ordered were from the German Federal Republic and from the Netherlands, and the way they wore this equipment reached the USSR was very typical, because the USSR had bilateral agreements with the countries like Algeria, Vietnam, India, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Syria, and Cuba, and with the oil-producing states in the Middle East and Northern African region, like Libya. And while working, the Soviet specialists, while working in these countries, were in a way like cooperating, getting to know certain technical specification and ordering the equipment from the developed capitalist countries via these states. So this mechanism was finally used in order to sign the contracts with U.S. company Cameron, today part of Schlumberger Limited, the U.S. companies Otis and Camco International, and also with the Hungarian company Vodepsier. There is a certain discrepancies in the narrative of Igorevsky diary. At the start, he sounds extremely gloomy, and now, while distancing from this diary, I think that perhaps at the bottom of the heart, he never wanted to use the underground nuclear explosion, nor the local authorities, all of them aware of what was going on, wanted it. And what he criticized as the lack of local management was perhaps also, in a way, a sabotage. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Irina. Okay, our last speaker in this panel, Mateusz Borowski, who is already took his position. Mateusz Borowski is a professor at the Department of Performative Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. He holds a PhD from Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany, and the Jagiellonian University. Currently, his main areas of interest are green humanities, counterfactual discourses and speculative fabulations in the context of climate change. He published, among others, book titled in English, Strategies of Forgetting Memory and Cyberculture, 2015. It was published in Polish, but the title is in English. Okay. And with Małgorzata Sugiera, a book titled Artificial Nature's Performances of Technoscience and Art in 2017. He is currently a principal investigator in the Opus 22 research project titled After Climate Crisis, No Scalable Survival Strategies in Speculative Fabulations of the last 2 decades, funded by the Polish National Science Center. And today, Mateusz will present a paper titled Forgetting Accursed Share, Violent Obsolescence of Electronic Junkyards. Please.
Thank you. I guess I want to join Irina in thanking you for showing up at this time of night, so thanks a lot. Waste of various kinds and origins, circulating on a global scale and accumulating in the form of landfills, marine garbage patches, and electronic junkyards, has become one of the tokens of the Anthropocene, the era of humans' impact on planetary systems. Despite decades of ecological activism, not only does the production of waste increase, creating major environmental crises all over the world, but also it's said to have become, quote-unquote, the most abundant and enduring trace of human epochs to come. Recent studies of this phenomenon are unanimous in arguing that ever since the problem of massive waste accumulation has been addressed in public policies around the mid-20th century, little success has been achieved in managing heaps of detritus produced by neo-colonial extractive capitalist economies. More than that, the major and currently dominant ways of framing waste in social and political discourse only exacerbate this emergency, particularly ever since waste collection and management have become major industrial enterprises, generating annually more and more income. As a result, public policies not only tend to focus nearly predominantly on post-consumption waste, making invisible a much more abundant and detrimental waste generated in the course of industrial production and consumption of electronic equipment. What's more, out of all possible solutions to the waste predicament, recycling has become the main strategy of dealing with the problem, despite the fact that compared to other methods, such as repairing, repurposing, and reusing, it generates enormous amounts of pollution, considerable carbon footprint, and various forms of slow violence in garbage heaps and junkyards, predominantly located in the global south, but also increasingly in Central and Eastern Europe. For example, Poland has been one of the major European importers on this market, and the tonnage of waste brought to the country has grown fourfold since 2018. And the reason for this is not only increasing consumption, although existing reports forecast an even faster growth of electronic waste in the wake of the introduction of the 5G technology. But what's crucial is that China, which was formerly the biggest recycler of junk in the world, in 2018 introduced a ban on waste import. Although the ban was partly lifted in 2021, the European waste market has already started absorbing the surplus of recyclable waste, according to the estimates published on the official site of the EU Green Deal plan. It's these places of waste accumulation that Peter C. Little identifies, in these places that Little identifies the phenomenon of the so-called violent obsolescence, the direct displacement-based experience and suffering of laborers, fueled by an electronic industry that actively values material obsolescence. This concept puts to the foreground the fact that waste has not only become a major ecological problem, but also, because of its continued commodification, the current recycling schemes, which involve transport contributing to overall carbon footprint, toxic chemical pollution, and destruction of local ecosystems, only prolong the ecological catastrophe that has been unfolding due to the accumulation of waste in the post-war era. The European Green Deal, a program of dealing with environmental problems currently implemented by the European Union, clearly exemplifies such a misguided effort at communal work for the livable future. A major objective of the program is to make Europe the first climate-neutral continent until 2050, through implementation of a number of schemes, including the work of renewable energy sources, sustainable agriculture, and protection of biodiversity. Already the mission statement of the main page of the program, published on the official website of European Union, makes it clear that the package of measures to reduce the greenhouse effect provides, quote-unquote, an opportunity for fostering competitiveness and resilience. An initiative clearly implements the major principles of capitalist economy. Clearly, this future-oriented agenda frames the innovative methods of dealing with waste as another instance of neoliberal techno-fix that partakes of the narrative of progress, which should purportedly bring a clean and sustainable future conditioned by advancements in the field of recycling technology. And this narrative dangerously occludes the fact that waste is, as Myra Hurd puts it, a wicked problem, one which, due to its complexity, generates a multiplicity of often contradictory solutions. And another scholar dealing with the problem, Josh Lepowski, argues in his study of e-waste management that these framings of the waste problem, quote unquote, need to be made strange again, because they are part of the problem rather than routes to equitable solutions. We must defamiliarize waste, or said differently, make waste strange again, unquote. This defamiliarization also needs to involve looking into the complicated genealogies of the waste predicament, often occluded by the official environmental policies. The awareness of this part may prove crucial in coming to terms with the waste predicament and working out a livable future for humans and non-humans alike. So what I'd like to do is take a look at how this task of making waste strange again is being fulfilled by non-fictional and speculative literary and artistic genres, which often offer counter-narratives to the progress-oriented agenda of the European Green Deal. So I'll be looking closely at two examples of such counter-narratives coming from Central European context, and I'll think about those wayward genealogies of today's waste problem and the ways in which it can be represented for the sake of future. A future more livable than the one offered by the scenarios of progress towards an increased recycling that foreclose the complicated pasts of the region. What's manifestly missing from the visions of carbon-neutral, clean futures imagined by the Green Deal is an account of the environmental damage that has already been caused in the course of the consumption-related accumulation of waste and various ways of recycling them all over the world, and particularly in East and Central Europe. It seems that this agenda is based on the foundational gesture of erasing the multitude of dispersed deleterious effects of the increased circulation of waste, particularly since the mid-20th century. And this story of waste as a new kind of extractivist production needs to be uncovered, as, for example, Heike Weber claims in her contribution to the recently published volume Greening Europe. She argues that this shared legacy of pollution caused by waste is a problematic one today when the effects of inefficient waste management from the 1950s onward are felt throughout Europe, although the production of waste in the post-war era was rather uneven in the Western and Eastern Europe in the post-war period. Also, she argues that when in the West, recycling was invented and propounded together with the steady increase in consumption of the Western side of the Iron Curtain, particularly in the affluent 1970s and 80s. In the Eastern Bloc until the 1990s, it was framed more as a way of efficient recovery of resources and often the only source of raw materials. These different yet entangled pasts of strategies of dealing with waste still reverberate today and manifest themselves in the form of various kinds of pollution and toxicity that are a shared burden of European nations which need to not only stay with the trouble of waste itself, but also its problematic past. I'll take a look at two attempts at this counteracting of this obliteration of the knowledge and memory of genealogy of waste, stories that complicate this neoliberal agenda of progress, to put it simply. Such an attempt has been made by the Polish essayist Stanisław Łubieński in his What We Leave Behind from 2020, who right from the start makes it clear that quote-unquote cleaning is not enough. And actually his book is an intervention in the politics of garbage and waste disposal. But what's significant in the context of those problems that I'm addressing, the structure of this book is manifestly different from the typical scientific or scholarly account of the effects of waste on environment, supported by carefully collected statistical data. Repeatedly expressing his helplessness in the face of the waste predicament, or even, as he says, ecological neurosis, Łubieński seems to be well aware that this story cannot be told as a piece of investigative journalism with clearly established causes and perpetrators. And the structure of this book and the point of view on the matter in question are encapsulated in the very beginning, when Łubieński recounts a day in the beginning of the summer of 2018, when he was on holidays on the Polish seaside and started collecting garbage on the beach, which turned out to be cluttered by objects coming from distant locations and epochs. So he realized that each of the 28 objects that he gathered and put in a found sock tells a different story, not only about its origin, but also of large-scale historical and cultural processes, as well as technological innovations which led to the excessive production of waste in our time. Accordingly, what we leave behind is constructed as such a collection of stories told by individual pieces of waste, which Łubieński subsequently collected in different regions of Poland, in the Sudeten Mountains, Roztocze in east central Poland, and near the city Suwałki in the north of the country. And for this reason, each chapter, marked with a date and precise geographical location, is devoted to a different object, from the omnipresent plastic bag through plastic packaging and electronic waste of various kinds. So instead of drawing conclusions from statistical data, Łubieński has done extensive field research in each of these locations, going where a given object had led him. This method allowed him to demonstrate a peculiar agency of waste which seems to move across the world, not only transported as an object of trade, but also drifting on sea currents and cropping up and gathering in unexpected locations. He focuses particularly on those pieces of waste which seem out of place in a given region, like the duty-free plastic bag from the Black Sea that he has found on the coast of the Baltic Sea, or the packaging of English products from the British supermarket Sainsbury's that found their way to the garbage dump in the Polish town of Zgierz. By attempting to depict the extent of this current predicament, the waste predicament, from the perspective of the objects themselves, he demonstrates that this entanglement of past causes cannot be presented in a linear order of a historical narrative. So what he proposes is a kind of attentiveness to the pathways that each piece of waste has traveled and the uncertain futures that it leads to. So this, as he writes in the final chapter, may prepare us better for the times ahead than the projected utopian visions of green Europe that sanction further exploitation of environmental and human resources. His method of tracing the pathways of waste corresponds with more general remarks on the transformative agency of waste made by Catherine Yusuf in her essay Indeterminate Subjects, Irreducible Worlds, in which she defamiliarizes the agency of waste, often obliterated by the narratives of progress towards a green future. Just like Łubieński, Yusuf also emphasizes an essential and indeterminate agency of waste, which acts even when it's removed from view or recycled, entering ecosystems and bodies in the forms of toxic substances that may alter their genetic makeup for generations to come. Trying to prepare us for the future to come, Yusuf emphasizes that in the world increasingly permeated and shaped by anthropogenic waste, for the sake of working out more pragmatic approaches to the environmental predicament, we must, quote unquote, avoid the nostalgia of reconciliation that might return us to the coherent and uncontaminated body, unquote. This defamiliarization of waste may prove critical in times when it seems that the problem of waste will not go away, but rather will become one of the troubles that we are bound to stay with for centuries to come. And it's from this perspective that the way we remember the catastrophes caused by the excessive waste accumulation needs to be reassessed and rethought in times of major environmental crisis. So, as Yusuf suggests, we should embrace and make space for the latent and indeterminate potentials of waste to generate potentially livable entanglements. It's with this in mind that I would like to approach my second example, the works of the Polish artist Diana Lelonek, who was also mentioned by Łubieński, who accompanied her during one of her field trips in search of waste for her ongoing project Center for Living Things, when she gathered discarded objects that have been grown over by plants or inhabited by living creatures. This project was different in its concept to Łubieński's book, because although both told the story of the past of waste by tracing particular objects and weaving together the stories, Lelonek was predominantly interested in showing how remnants of extractivist culture enter ecosystems and become their integral element, changing them and being changed in return as beings composed of natural and technological elements. In this respect, the discarded objects can no longer be called waste. They are not wasted, but rather become elements of entanglements that produce new forms of life and cohabitation. However, I'd like to refer here to Lelonek's different work, a 3-channel installation called Stork, a Sacred Bird from 2022, presented as part of the program Islands of Kindship, organized by the Latvian Center for Contemporary Art. Contrary to the Center for Living Things, this installation focused on the agency of discarded objects on local ecosystems and the life of particular populations of species inhabiting it. The installation presented the material that the artist gathered by filming the white stork population of the Gejtlini landfill site, located just outside of Riga, the largest landfill in the Baltic region. It's a general landfill, waste landfill. She presented this recorded material in a speculative format by providing it with a voiceover commentary in which she freely reinterpreted scientific findings about the changes in the habits of birds that come to feed on large landfills all over Europe. Lelonek has deliberately chosen this particular species because white stork in Eastern European traditions has from time immemorial symbolized not only prosperity but also the purity of nature. But as the voiceover in her installation informs the viewer, the great garbage dumps attract the birds which look for food there and as a consequence alter their living habits. So the narrator not only claims that storks have changed their diet, now dependent on human eating habits and mainly consisting of fast food leftovers, but also possibly by permanently dwelling in this toxic wasteland. They became poisoned and significantly weakened by this environment, and most probably will never produce offspring. Also, the future fate remains precarious in the face of the European plans to close all open landfills on the continent as part of the Green Deal. So this particular population of storks in Gejtlin becomes a token of a community living on the ruins of capitalist consumption culture. But what's significant from the point of view of my paper, in her speculative documentary, Lelonek tells the story of the landfill by showing to what extent the past and future of the populations inhabiting those polluted places have become affected by human consumption culture. Thus, storks, instead of being symbols of pure nature, become exemplary beings entangled in natural cultural environments, which came into being as a result of historical and civilizational processes operating on different scales, and therefore impossible to render and analyze in a linear narrative. Probably for this reason, she has chosen to thematize these processes by putting center stage the bodies of birds and their behavior, in which these processes have left numerous traces and alterations. Both of these examples that I have looked into make it clear that Little's concept of violence obsolescence, in order to become operative and as an analytics of waste predicament, needs to be extended to include not only the human laborers of landfills and waste heaps, but also non-humans that are being affected by this displacement-based experience of suffering in the wake of excessive waste production. Łubieński and Jelonek in their works capture this dimension of waste circulation by inventing forms of making waste strange again that clearly undermine the Green Deal agenda of clean future, that promises a rupture from the polluted past. Instead, they argue for a necessity to include in our plans for the future the legacy of the current catastrophe and the ecological effects of which are bound to last for centuries to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mateusz, for your paper. So, it was a great pleasure to moderate this panel. We had 5 brilliant, very insightful papers. I would say that you told us the story about catastrophe changing societies, land, animals, plants in several ways. For me, at some point, I think all of these papers was partially on multi-level connected with colonialism at some point. I don't know if you agree. Maybe we can discuss it, but firstly, I would like to give the voice to our audience and encourage you to ask our panelists a question. Questions, yes.
Thank you. I have a question to Irina about, is it still used, the narrative of Tengiz catastrophe today in modern films or any memorial narratives? Thank you.
Yes, Irina, you can answer. It will be. It should be working.
So it works. Thank you very much for your question. There has been constant attempt to prevent the development of this public debate in Kazakhstan at present, and any kind of and various ways of just marginalize an attempt to start debating this the issue of the Tengiz catastrophe. It is first of all connected to the policies of the establishment of the former government of Nazarbayev's tenure. Nazarbayev played a crucial role in developing the plans for developing the Tengiz oil field and in signing the contracts with Chevron. And the contracts had been negotiated at the end of the 1980s. First of all, with Gorbachev, Nazarbayev, and Chevron, and the representatives of the US government who were lobbying the interests of Chevron and providing for this entering techniques. There is a quest from Kazakhstani society on the condition of the agreement that had been signed with Chevron in 1993. Western Kazakhstan has become the most prosperous and rich part of Kazakhstan, providing for these enormous revenues. There has been silencing from the Soviet side. There has been silencing from, the Central Authorities side. Silencing from the Kazakhstani Republic. Just the lack of desire of the local administrations who also built their genealogies around developing these resources in the 1990s. Lack of desire to talk about the Tengiz disaster. Finally, the transnational oil companies and their monopolistic subcontractors who are participating in liquidating this disaster, they also are not particularly willing or not willing at all to reveal the data. Their tactics and their policies, it is also worldwide, was always to raise some community awareness. So the new community genealogies of the families of oil workers, as they call them in Kazakhstan, and not to argue with the central government about nation-building policies, moreover to appropriate the Soviet and Kazakhstani national symbols for their socialization of chevron in the city of Atirau. So all these powerful actors up until now, unfortunately, prevent the public debate. There is nevertheless some open source, some discussion in social media, very often connected to lots of conspiracies. Also vis-a-vis nuclear policies and the usage of nuclear explosions in Western Kazakhstan in the 1980s in the industry of extracting hydrocarbons.
Thank you very much for this beautiful thought, like very inspiring panel. And I will start with a comment and then I will move to my questions to the authors of our first papers. And I'm not the only one that feels that they were personal for me, as I'm a Silesian myself, and I have my family memory consists the story of my grandfather's serious illness directly linked to working in a chemical factory in the 1950s, mostly with DDT. And I wonder what makes this family stories, very ephemeris, related to slow violence, become an important story, a compelling story in a collective memory, as was the case with the lead poisoning, and not in the case of the others. And I thought that we are dealing with a very compelling story that contains these constant motives, like children as the victims, a woman whistleblower fighting the system, and therefore we have what we were talking about yesterday, that we have some kind of perpetrators, even if it is the system or the socialist system that is poisoning our children. So it's also this moment of this socialist, say, and opposition tension. And it was somehow easier to notice the lead poisoning, small in numbers, than to see the numerous deaths due to, for example, cancer or respiratory diseases in Upper Silesia. And I wonder what makes these stories. Would you agree that slow violence somehow must gain some kind of pace, some kind of scandal to be noticed? Like this slow violence, what makes this slow violence memory, especially due to environment pollution, a part of collective memory? What are the factors? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I would say it's if you go back to Rob Nixon's book, it's all about the formats that we should invent or reinvent in order to make the slow violence as this dispersed catastrophe, which is not about the one event or even a bounded event. And he actually argues against the backdrop of his argument is the media, the media meaning TV, film, and those audiovisual formats, which, as he argues, tend to focus on the spectacular, right? And for him, fiction, especially like the mixture of fiction, non-fiction, narrative strategy, is a way to actually tell this story, which goes which goes, which surpasses those boundaries of an event, right? But I think what's visible in this lead poisoning epidemic is that confluence of factors that also make this kind of pop up, because the subtitle of Jędryka's work, which is actually, and it's not a good word in this context, pioneer in this discourse, is the forgotten epidemic, and definitely there is this we cannot think about this this unraveling or this remembering of the lead poisoning epidemic without the COVID-19, which was the instant kind of trigger for this in many sorts of ways, from commercial in terms of like publishing choices, but also in terms of the lived experience of people, which could be which was made relatable by Jędryka in this context. So I think answering your question would be that we should attend to ways of telling those stories, so formats and the dramaturgies that the slow violence is narrated or is remembered, but also we should go outside to show those kind of contingent factors that could make this pop up somehow, which is contingent at the first sight, but when we go deeper, we could find those different complex stories that kind of underlie those slow violence stories. So yeah, that's my provisional answer for now. Thank you.
Thank you for all those papers. They were brilliant, really, and I really enjoyed this wonderful panel. I got the question to Mateusz Borowski. I was wondering, maybe I got it wrong, but generally I think that this discussion around wasteland somehow, I would say, is still based on a very traditional division among culture and nature, and that the waste is treated mostly as a kind of cultural waste, invasive cultural waste. And I was wondering if you maybe see some kind of way out of this trap, as all those objects go through this reproduction, natural cultural production of material features that exist in it, as they are being left behind, and then go through the process of overgrowth with nature and so on and so forth. So, and if of course we think of the damages that are produced by that kind of materials with burning it, or some kind of disaster or catastrophe that comes out of it, I'd say that also we have a kind of course, that kind of situations in so-called natural environment, as gases are produced by nature and released to the atmosphere and so on. So I was wondering if you could maybe comment on trying to overcome this natural cultural division among those wastes and nature, as we as also animals produce something that is cultural, but also a product of nature somehow. So what do you think about this? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're absolutely right, and in a way, part of the problem of this waste predicament is the fact that we are still in this old way of thinking that we were pure at some point, and then everything got spoiled. Yeah, that's exactly what Yusuf calls the nostalgia for uncontaminated past that we want to reproduce in the future. And I think that this is something that's really tricky when you think about the way in which we try to remove waste from our side, not really understanding that there are no borders for waste, for example. Both in terms of national and continental borders, but also borders between nature and culture as well. So I guess this is, part of the problem that was addressed by the previous question, that what we call slow violence is also so tricky, because it's premised on this, as you said, this division between natural causes and man-produced pollution, whether in fact at some point it becomes one and the same thing. So I guess what Lelónek was trying to show is that we are fooling ourselves thinking that we can, I don't know, close landfills and then animals will return to the state of purity. The disturbance is so deep that, and actually the example of storks is quite good because there's studies that show that it's not only Gatelin that's affected in this way. There are large landfills in Spain, for example, where storks do not fly to Africa anymore because they stay there, and that's because they have waste to feed on. But the problem is that this waste, because of its contamination, also produces mutations of certain kinds, depending on what kind of waste we are dealing with. So the whole problem produces ecosystems which are bound to reproduce in a way. Also, for example, for Lelónek, what's significant is that those birds that stay are the weak birds. So in a way, there's also this slow violence of the poor, in this case, slow violence of those beings that somehow cannot really go on their own to Africa. So in a sense, those traveling routes are also disturbed. So you asked about the way out of it. I think that the way out of it is not towards the progressive, clean future. The way out of it, I think that we are only beginning to recognize the extent of the problem. And the problem of waste, the studies that I read, they are quite helpless in the face of it, because they showed how effective this division of nature and culture is in implicating us in reproducing this problem. So I'm afraid I don't have a optimistic answer to this question. I guess I'm just trying to see the problem more than the solutions.
I thank you very much once again for brilliant speeches. It was so great to hear you. And I have a question to Ivan, because you started talking about your topic, and you said that you used to use the post-colonial perspective. And I started wondering, how useful is the perspective for you from your point of view? It's completed, or maybe it should be developed? Because I was thinking about the source, the growth of the perspective, and I started thinking, what do you think about it? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It is a brilliant question, and well, it does deserve probably another conference to talk about the post-colonial perspective in a way it treats the I don't want to use the term post-socialist, but well, the countries which were part of Soviet Union at some point. And well, to my mind, yeah, this post-colonial theory in general does not have the capacity to explain fully the relationship between the Russia, whether it is Russian Empire, Muscovite Tsardom, Soviet Union or Russian Federation, and the countries which were some time ago the colonies, and the contemporary part of this problem, of course. So something needs to be done to this problem. And yeah, of course, we can talk about Edward Said, we can talk about Homi Babla, but to my mind, still I, as a researcher, lack the instruments to be able to speak about Donbass in a post-colonial perspective. Although in my presentation, I used the framework of extractivist policy, right? I was talking about extractivism, which is an element of post-colonial theory. But yeah, I'm in the process. I have a justification. I'm a doctoral student, so I have time, yeah, to figure it out, to attend more conferences and read more. So yeah, that's my answer.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talks. I tie on to the last question, or actually I have a remark to Ivan. I would argue that this in Ukraine is actually Russian imperialism, as Putin annexed these territories, also the Crimea, and he once he told that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical crisis or catastrophe in the 20th century. I think he considers Ukraine not as a colony, but rather as a very important part of his empire, a core part. So I would rather argue it's not colonialism than rather imperialism in this case. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll engage in the discussion, and yeah, you are right. He does consider Ukraine as part of Russia, and that's the problem. Of course, we can be speaking about imperialism versus colonialism, but the core, I think, of both is pretty similar. You treat a nation as, from the perspective of superior. You do not treat someone as equal to you, and it goes in all possible directions. Of course, British imperialism, colonialism, for instance, and the Russian one are different, because the one is built on constructing the image of the other, and Russian colonialism is built on the construction of the image of the same. We are the same as you, but the core is still the same. You do not recognize someone as worthy to have the same rights, to be independent, and so on and so forth. So that's the core for me. And yeah, also your comment just proves that the discussion is still very needed, very needed.
Okay.
I just thought that the strategies of colonial extractivisms are the same, which start at the moment when you treat people as resource, in a sense, and you give them equality, but only in order to exploit them, just as you exploit the resources. So I think that there is no really opposition between imperialism and colonialism. Strategies are basically quite similar, and they are quite efficient in learning one from another.
I just want to bring to the table the concept that the Eb Annis put forward. She points out that the socialist policies and the socialist strategies, she calls them colonialism in camouflage, which makes the situation even more layered and complicated because of the anti-colonial agenda of the Soviet Union, as opposed to the West, right, the colonizing West, which actually occludes those colonial practices that Mateusz actually pointed out to, that treating people as resources, treating land as parcelable, that could be made into parcels, made into, for instance, dump fills, and those, for instance, dump sites of that could be polluted for some reason or another. So now I would say we have to go both ways. So kind of dismantle the binary opposition between colonialisms and the Western colonialisms and Eastern colonialism, so to speak, which is even still a binary opposition. But also we should, and that's where I would address this issue from, is to go the bottom-up way, to show those borderlands, those really complicated sites of what Annis calls the Soviet borderlands, which actually in Poland is interesting in this context as both the site of colonization and the site from which colonization also took place, for instance, in Ukraine, right? So, which is also like a controversial topic, but for some reason, and we should kind of find narratives and formats and ways of telling those stories that show the dynamic obsolescences and visibilities of colonialisms and the situation of colonizing and being colonized.
Then I would also feel like adding a bit to colonial and post-colonial or neo-colonial. The present developments, of course, just urge some kind of response from scholars in Slavic and Eurasian studies, and post-colonial is acquiring so much steam at the point. It is also very much noticeable in the development of Central Asian studies, rediscovering post-colonial once again. But I, for example, in a way, like asking myself if the synergies of post-colonial studies on other parts of the world, for example, post-colonial studies on Asia, also post-colonial studies on the Middle East and Northern Africa, the way also how they were discussed by the scholars from the region in the 1970s and the 1980s, is taken in any way in a consideration, because there is some kind of repetition of certain debates and certain focus. And in a way, like I hope that your generation perhaps would let us move beyond the to upgrade the paradigms and to get ahead from post. In a way, Kazakhstan, on which I was talking today, could be attributed as a classical post-colonial example in a way due to its resource dependency path. Yeah, it is a feature of post-colonial. Rent-seeking strategies of the elite is another feature of post-colonial. However, the Central Asian politician actors, agents also from Kazakhstan, has actually contributed much more to certain patterns of international development worldwide, and perhaps this is also something that we should focus on.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? No. So let me ask one general one. I think that in most or all the cases described by you, the lands were influenced by catastrophes in your papers were specific lands, inhabited by non-dominant group of people, weaker people because of nationality, ethnicity, whatever. Do you think that the stories about these catastrophes are influenced because of that, because of voiceless of these people on several levels? This is not a direct question, so.
Okay, let me, because this is what's really on my mind and was throughout this paper, and that's why I ended with the politics of lower frequency, because there is a great danger, I think, with this performative strategy of giving the voice to the voiceless, because we have to think about which kind of subjectivity, what kind of subjectivity we are ascribing to those voiceless. And if we're not kind of reproducing the dominant Western subject to the people who have never been granted this position of the Western subject, and somehow now we're telling them you have to be, or you have to find in your past the moments where you actually were the subject, you were the voice, you had the voice. Whereas, and this is the work of Elizabeth Povinelli, and also the work of Black studies scholars, who actually are really wary of this reproduction of the white Western subjectivity. That's why we have to kind of that's why practices, attending to practices, to those different seemingly unimportant practices of everyday life, might offer a way out of this kind of predicament which and all, but actually that's really hard, because every time in all those cases we should in a way kind of find a new way of thinking about this, about subjectivity, even to invent a new concepts, new ways of framing those agencies, because agency also is a problematic concept. Ascribing agency to those who have been systemically devoid of any agency, deprived of agency, is problematic when it comes to now we allow you to have the agency, right? So I think that's a great question and great kind of great kind of reminder for our ways of ascribing agency, ascribing voice to people, for whom, for instance, the voice has never been as important as, for instance, relations between their body and their land, which was even more important than voice, in the sense like having a voice, having something to say, or even making sounds, for instance.
Can I say,
Even,
or maybe someone who hasn't talked yet? Yeah, sure.
We can say something about the case of Upper Silesia. It's an industrial region, and we are still thinking about the memory of this industrial region, about how to remember the industrial past of this now post-industrial region. And when we are talking about colonial and imperial interpretations, we can say that there was always a word colonial in interpretations of Upper Silesia situation since 19th century. But I think that colonial, imperial, and industrial can be treated as three modes of modernism, three modes of modern exploitation of earth, of people, of cheap nature, as Jason W. Moore would said. So it's not useful to think about, for example, Upper Silesia as colony, or the part of imperial, of German imperium. It's better to think about this place as an industrial region, and I think that every industrial region has the same experience of being something like internal colony of the old state, and the place that fueled the modernization of all state. And we give the example of allotment gardens, and it's something that is paradoxical and complicated, because it was something for workers, something that should be good for them, friendly for them. It should improve their diet and give them a place to rest, but it was at the same time it was the place of slow violence. And when we are talking with them now, we have to find in their speaks elements of memory that they are not conscious. It's not so it's not so easy that they will talk about the contamination of the earth, but sometimes in their words or phrases there will be traces of this old consciousness. For example, they they say that in other districts it was much bigger contamination than in their districts. So sometimes it's in presuppositions, in implications of their words that there were the consciousness of and there is a memory of the contamination, but it's not easy to say about it.
Thank you, Ivan.
Yeah,
Short.
I have a mic, but I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes. First, I have 2 remarks to say. And I want to follow up on what Mateusz has been talking about. So, first, as I said in my speech, Donbas miners were the image of Donbas, the representation of Donbas. And since 1920s, late 20s, until 1991, 0 books were devoted to Donbas miners where they would be talking, where they would be speaking and talking about themselves, obviously. After 1991 to 2014, 1 book, which is a scientific academic book, was produced, let's say, by British scholars, not by Ukrainian scholars, about miners. And the book is called Donbas Miners Speak. So only 1 book in 1993. And now more books are produced, it is true, but they're still not academic, but more of popular historical books about Donbas miners. So it's just 1 example. But I want to give you another example, which is my personal example and me being involved in academic community. I do feel pretty often excluded from academic community and looked down on, based on the fact that I come from Donbas and I am trying to speak about myself. I very often hear people from Western academic institutions who look down on me and tell me that I am wrong about the things which I know I am right about. I don't feel equal in academia. So, yeah, I'm this person who comes from Donbas and speaks. But at a conference in Vienna Anthropology Days, I was criticized for talking on behalf of Donbas people, not even living in Donbas now. In Stockholm, I was called too aggressive for saying that some people from Donbas do not speak Russian. I do not speak Russian. And here I also had some issues. So, I think it is a problem, and we have to speak about that. And I'm happy that we brought this topic up, and I spoke about that because, well, at first I wanted to make a statement about that before my presentation, but I thought it would affect my presentation and I would be too emotional. But since we brought up this topic now, I'm happy I spoke out. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan, especially for this personal perspective, which is very important, actually. Okay, we are around out of time, but I need to make a small comment because I really like Marta and Pavel paper about allotment gardens. Actually, it reminds me about my huge trauma. I call it the terror of gooseberry jam, made by my mom and eaten like 3-4 times per week sometimes with French pancakes, which was terrible. So just a short question because we don't have too much time and we can elaborate later during the break. I think that allotment gardens are very important for the Silesian culture, maybe not fundamental, but very important. And we have some experience, but everything has changed or started to change around 1989, probably. So do you see the influential role of allotment garden nowadays still? Like, it is still important for Silesian people or not so much anymore?
I think it's still important, but now we have better knowledge about the soil that is in this garden. I will give 1 example. My grandma's stepbrother have a allotment garden in Mysłowice, and it was about 20 years ago. or 30 years ago. And a few years ago, I look at the geochemical maps for Upper Silesia, and I saw that there were many colors in this area. This soil was full of lead, zinc, cadmium, and in the 19th century there was zinc wars called Rosalia, and I didn't know about it. Nobody told me about it. My mother told me that there was a place, everybody called it Rosalka or Rosalia, but there was no conscious that there were zinc work, and the soil could be contaminated still. And in many other places where the allotment gardens are in Upper Silesia, the soil is contaminated. You can see it on this map. So it's popular, but I'm not sure is it safe to have garden in Upper Silesia.
Yeah. From my perspective, allotment gardens now are used just to have parties there, not to grow up vegetables or fruits, mostly, but maybe. Okay, but let's discuss it later. Now there is a time for coffee break, but unfortunately, I have not a very good announcement to you, but important one. Recently, library building has been subject to death. So we ask you to keep a close eye on your valuables and not to leave your phone, laptop, wallet, luggage unattended. Please take them with you during coffee and lunch breaks, and do not leave anything in the conference room or in the cloakroom. And if you need any help with your belongings, please contact the organizer or thieves, probably. Thank you, and have a nice coffee break.